author, board member par excellence, Flint, to give us actually a preview of what you're going to see in more depth at the Vietnam Symposium coming up. A couple admin stuff to start off with. This week is the last chance to see the Battle of the Bulge exhibit upstairs. Once the museum shuts down at the end of this month, we're going to be taking that down and creating a new one, focus on the Vietnam War. Again, you might just put on your calendar the first 2 weeks of April, the museum's going to be closed while the city's coming in and replacing a lot of the kind of the flooring, the rugs and stuff we have upstairs. So for at least the first 2 weeks, it's going to be kind of quiet around here. I'd just like to highlight again a marvelous magazine, Veterans Life. Many of you probably see it in the chair next to you. If you haven't got a copy, please take one. It's excellent. And it's got a great article in here about the museum and stuff as well. And again, for $25 for an annual subscription, it's well worth it. And we normally will have some copies here. So we have lots of extras. So please take one. The Civil War Annex, Bob is not here today, but if you've never had it, if you have any sort of interest in the Civil War, would love to see some Civil War artifacts and see the history behind all of this, Bob Mulder has a marvelous collection. And it's in the basement of his house, and he just loves to have visitors come to see it. So if you think you'd all would have even a young person who would have an interest in the Civil War, just give him a call. I have copies of his little flyer here. And he's normally around, so he would love to have visitors come. Yeah, Fred.
How large a group can be?
I'd say about 3. You know, downstairs it's pretty tight. So 3, 4 at a max for that. Fred.
I just want to say Bob's basement is better than the museum in Gettysburg.
Well, yeah, very true. And not only that, you get a marvelous person to come along and explain everything you're looking at. So again, I can't highlight more. You'd find it very rewarding. And then simply the last thing here is, of course, you know, we have the upcoming Vietnam War Symposium, and I presume Flint will talk a little bit about that. But if you don't know yet too much about it, I have copies of the program here. It starts at 9 o'clock. I keep thinking 10. 9 to 4. But it's going to be really quite a chance for many of us who'd served in Vietnam to kind of tell our stories in kind of a very abbreviated fashion. But we'll certainly hear more about that. So without further ado, Flint, come on up. Let me make sure you're...
Hear me in the back? All right, wonderful. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate that. And
Your cell phones.
yes, there you go. As Mike said, we have our big event next Saturday. Not here, but at the Broomfield Auditorium. So don't come here unless you want to help move some things to the auditorium. We have, I want to say, 14 speakers lined up. And what we're trying to do is cover a broad range of experiences, branches of service, just everything. I mean, we've got infantry, we've got helicopters, we've got jets, we've got B-52s, we've got medics, we have an Army nurse, we have a donut dolly from the American Red Cross. All of these people will be talking very briefly, 15, 20 minutes each, about their experiences. And I think you'll You'll find it enlightening, even if you've never been to Vietnam. I think this will give you an overview of what the individuals went through during their tour over there. Let me just look through here. I guess you could say our featured speaker next week is a retired Marine Corps aviator named Orson Swindle. Odd name, but that was his name. Orson Swindle III. He was shot down over North Vietnam in 1966, spent 6 years as a prisoner of war of the North Vietnamese at the Hanoi Hilton, and for a time was the cellmate of John McCain. So Fred is going to facilitate the conversation with Orson on stage. He's a very fascinating individual. So what you're going to see today in my slideshow, and I should also mention a couple things. I have to leave right away. My wife and our grandson is playing in the 4A basketball finals at 11:30, so we got to dee-dee mow and get out of here. So if anybody has any questions at the end of the program, address them to my friend Grady here, who was instrumental in our big production next week. And we've got enough Vietnam veterans here, they can answer any questions as well. I want to start out by showing you this video that we put together. Grady did a wonderful job on this. That will begin our show next week as well, but I'll give you a sneak preview today. Oops. So that's kind of the opening to our symposium next week. Let's give Grady a hand for putting this together. As the guys in the Navy say, bravo Zulu, job well done. I'd also at this point like to recognize all of you fellow Vietnam graduates. So if you would stand or raise your hand if that's better for you. All right.
Stand closer to the TV.
There? We're good? Okay. Well, thank you all. When I'm working on a book, I always like to start with the backstory to talk about what brought us to the present moment in the book or film or whatever it is. And those of you who have read my book, the three of you who are here, I believe that you can't know where we are or where we're going unless you know where we've been. And so, especially with Vietnam, it's been 60 years since the war began, 50 years since it ended, and a lot of memories have passed since that period of time. And some people today are still wondering, well, how did we get involved in this war in Southeast Asia? So I want to go through here with a little history lesson. The road to America's involvement in Vietnam began with the end of World War II. The end of World War II also spelled the end for colonialism. The British lost India and Singapore, and Belgium's, Holland's, and France's overseas holdings were also headed for independence. Part of French Indochina became Vietnam. The traditional spelling is Vietnam, two words. We've managed over the years to combine them into one, but it means people of the South, that is, south of China. France had colonized Vietnam in 1887, along with Siam, that became Cambodia, and Laos, to create what they called French Indochina. But the locals had always chafed under foreign powers. In the 1920s and 30s, the idea of communism was spreading rapidly, and it found support among Vietnamese radicals. The founding of the Communist Party of Vietnam in 1930 was an important milestone in Vietnamese history. During World War II, the Japanese invaded and took control of most of Southeast Asia, including French Vietnam. The American OSS, the forerunner of today's CIA, sent in advisors to help a group known as the Viet Minh in their battle against the French, well, against the Japanese at this point. After the war, the French came back, ready to resume their control over Vietnam, but the Vietnamese were having none of it. Ho Chi Minh, the head of the Communist Party, asked the U.S. for help in kicking out the French, but the U.S. declined. After all, the French were our oldest allies, and the communists were, well, communists. In August of 45, under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, the Vietnamese people launched an uprising to seize control of their country from France, and the so-called Democratic Republic of Vietnam was proclaimed in September of 1945. Because France was unwilling to relinquish control of Indochina and the U.S. wouldn't help the communists, the previously mentioned Viet Minh took up the fight against the French and gained Vietnamese independence. Viet Minh would later morph into the Viet Cong. The post-World War II period saw additional rising tensions. The Soviet Union gained control of much of Eastern Europe, and along with Red China, which had just won a civil war, was seeking to expand communism in the East. A clash with the Western democracies was inevitable. The Korean War, from 1950 to 53, saw how this battle of Cold War ideologies could quickly escalate into a hot war. You all know about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that was formed in 1949 to defend against a possible Soviet incursion into Western Europe. Well, to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia. In 1954, a new organization called SEATO, for the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, was formed. Like NATO, it consisted of a coalition of nations that you see here on this list. They were bound to provide for the collective defense and were bound by treaty to provide mutual aid if one of them were attacked. So the question becomes, well, was SEATO really necessary? A popular concept of the time was called the domino theory. That is, if one nation in Southeast Asia fell to the communists, then the entire region would fall. And so, with the Viet Minh, the guerrilla force at war against the people and government of South Vietnam, the SEATO nations were treaty-bound to come to their aid. Although the U.S. had supported the Viet Minh in World War II against Japan, soon their communist leanings and communist activities in Southeast Asia caused the U.S. to show support for the South Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh would go on to form the National Liberation Front, the NLF, soon to become known as the Viet Cong or VC. The struggle with France lasted until 1954, when French forces were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, a little outpost in northwest Vietnam. This was engineered by Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giap, his best general. A ceasefire was agreed to at the Geneva Accord of that year, and according to the Geneva Accord, the country was to be temporarily divided along the 17th parallel into two territories, North and South Vietnam, which were expected to be reunified 2 years later following a general election. The U.S. and South Vietnam, however, did not sign the accord, and the elections never took place. The North was ruled by the communists, and the South was supported by a pro-U.S. government in Saigon. In the late 1950s, President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent a small group of military advisors to help train the South Vietnamese army to resist the communists, but not a whole lot of success resulted. And Ike had his hands full trying to contain Mao and Stalin. Poland and Hungary were revolting against their Russian masters, but were put down violently. So this was a time of great international tension. In 1961, newly elected American President John F. Kennedy declared in his inaugural address, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, and oppose any foe in order to assure the survival and success of liberty." I remember being inspired by those words and decided to serve my country when I graduated from college. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962 that pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war. In 1962, Kennedy sent a larger group of military advisors who would eventually number about 25,000. But within Kennedy's administration, there were widely diverging opinions on how best to halt the communist insurgency. In September of '63, Kennedy said that in the end, it was South Vietnam's war to win or lose. He said, "We can help them, we can give them equipment, we can send our men out there as advisors, but the people of Vietnam have to win it against the communists. But I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That would be a great mistake." The United States made this effort to defend Europe. Now Europe is quite secure. We also have to participate, we may not like it, in the defense of Asia. Kennedy, as you know, was assassinated 2 months later, and Lyndon Baines Johnson became the president. In early August of '64, an event called the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred. Supposedly, 2 American destroyers were attacked off the coast of North Vietnam, which led Kennedy's successor, President Johnson, and American officials to greatly escalate U.S. military involvement. Subsequently, it's believed that misinterpreted communications about this incident led to hundreds of thousands of American troops being sent to take over the bulk of the fighting from the South Vietnamese Army. Here, the first contingent of American ground forces is shown arriving near Da Nang in March of 65, 60 years ago. So we're just a few days over the 60th anniversary of the first ground troops arriving. We had been bombing the North and Viet Cong positions from the air, but this is the first time we sent in military ground troops. Initially, the majority of Americans supported the war effort, but as time went on and casualties mounted and victory seemed elusive, some Americans began protesting the war. The military draft was especially unpopular among the young. So we fast forward to 1968 then. By 1968, despite having been militarily defeated throughout South Vietnam for 4 years, the communists decided to make one last throw of the dice and planned a spectacular offensive that they hoped would cause the Southerners to rise up, join them, and expel the Allies. That operation was called the Tet Offensive. It was launched on the 30th of January, 1968, during the Lunar New Year festivities, the day after I got there. So it was kind of a welcoming. And it took place all across South Vietnam. You can see on the left map how the North Vietnamese had an incursion into Cambodia, which was kind of off limits to American firepower, and continued down the western border of South Vietnam, and then at the given hour attacked most of the major cities in South Vietnam. We put up this map of Korea, the Korean peninsula. There's a similarity between the geography here. The only difference being when North Korea and China invaded South Korea, they had to go north to south. But in Vietnam, they were able to skirt the western border and attack from the flank. That made a lot of difference in terms of their tactics. Let's see, where am I? By all accounts, the communist offensive, although a tactical surprise, much like the Germans' last gasp effort to stop the Allies during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, was a military disaster. Except for a few places such as Hue City and the Cho Lan district of Saigon, the VC and North Vietnamese were quickly defeated, and the South Vietnamese countryside, which had once been infiltrated by the communists, was now securely under South Vietnamese control. However, the American news media portrayed Tet as a communist victory. The American media's negative reporting added to the national trauma, causing many Americans to become disenchanted with General Westmoreland's leadership and earlier pronouncements that the end of the war was in sight. In February of '68, a month into the Tet Offensive, Walter Cronkite, the most respected American news anchor, reported from Vietnam. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion. And American public support for the war seriously eroded after Cronkite's pronouncement. President Johnson decided not to seek re-election. He was succeeded by Richard Nixon, who promised to end the war. The military effort officially ended on March 29th, 1973, after the Paris Peace Accord was signed and American forces began leaving the country. The POWs were released and American troops withdrew. Only the U.S. Embassy and a few thousand Department of Defense personnel remained. This is a shot of the presidential palace in Saigon with the North Vietnamese tanks rolling up to it. After the last American forces left, the communists renewed their efforts to take over all of South Vietnam, which they did. The South did its best to resist without U.S. support, but in April 1975, the VC and NVA overran the country, and there was a mad rush to escape. Tens of thousands of South Vietnamese civilians who survived the war did their best to escape the terror that was coming. Here we see some of the South Vietnamese army soldiers on the left being marched through Saigon by their captors. Thousands more of the South Vietnamese became victims of the communist terror. Those who weren't killed spent years in re-education camps. So why did the combined efforts of the U.S. and the other CETO countries not result in victory? I hate to say we lost, because we never surrendered, we just left. It was kind of like, in sports terms, you forfeited the game. After all, we had the best and most technologically advanced war fighting equipment. We had the best trained soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen in the world, and they were outstanding fighters. We had an unmatched logistical pipeline that the people fighting in Vietnam never had to want for anything. Our fighting force had plenty of nutritious food, even if some of it came in cans. I heard people laughing earlier. Yeah, and medical care for our troops was second to none. So why did we not win? I think the one answer is hubris. We were so confident of our rightness, of our cause, and the fact that we had the greatest war fighting capability in the world, and that just 20 years earlier, the U.S. had reigned supreme by winning the biggest, baddest world war in history. And now we were up against an army that wore footwear made from old car tires, for crying out loud. There was no way that we could not be successful, or so we thought. The second reason was because we lost the national will to win, or so, and why was that? Well, during World War II, the American people were 100% behind the war, inundated with pro-war, pro-victory messages from the Office of War Information, the OWI. Everyone on the home front was constantly being told to buy war bonds, to back the attack, to go along with gas and food rationing, to enlist, to do whatever was necessary to ensure victory. But there was almost none of that during the Vietnam War. Johnson had what was called a guns and butter policy. It was to be able to fight communism in Southeast Asia while building a great society at home with the least amount of sacrifice for the American people. Another reason for our lack of success was, I believe, because of the uncensored nature of news coming out of Vietnam. During World War II, the commanders in the field kept a tight rein over the journalists who were assigned to cover their combat activities. Reporters' words were censored, not only to prevent the enemy from knowing what we were doing, but also to prevent home front morale from being negatively affected by reports of heavy casualties or reverses on the battlefield. In Vietnam, however, reporters and journalists were given unfettered access, could go out with the units and report anything they saw without their words being scrutinized or censored or checked for accuracy. As a result, all the bad things that happen in every war flooded nightly into American living rooms. No wonder the American public turned against the war. The next three images are probably the lasting images and impressions that many Americans have about the war. A Buddhist monk burning himself in protest of the South Vietnamese government's treatment of Buddhists, the execution of a Viet Cong fighter by the Saigon police chief during Tet, and terrified children fleeing from the accidental bombing of their village. When the atrocities that occurred in World War II were shown or reported on, they were, without exception, those that were committed by the enemy, never by the Allies. As a result, home front support for the war remained strong. The unrelenting negative news coverage from Vietnam was in large part responsible for the growth of the anti-war movement. And one person who wrote about the impact of negative news coverage was this professor, Martin Hertz, who taught at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And he wrote this book that Mike Fellows loaned to me. And it had some very interesting insights. I'll spend some time talking about this. Quoting from Hertz's book as it pertains to media coverage of the war, Hertz talks about the differences between the high-tech American military and the VC and the NVA, who, for the most part, avoided pitched battles, and relied on stealth and ambushes. He said the American Army has many good qualities, but crafty and stealthy it is not. He also pointed out that over time, the VC and NVA were gradually pushed away from the most densely inhabited areas, and the control exercised by the South Vietnamese government gradually increased, but there was nothing dramatic to point to. The situation created a real problem for the reporters, especially those whose medium required visual images. One could get pictures of a Vietnamese village being bombed or shelled and would see the dead and wounded and the refugees streaming away. Such things have happened in all wars, and nobody thought it reprehensible at that time. But the Vietnam War was different because it was all filmed and almost instantaneously flashed into the living rooms of American homes, accompanied by the reporters' comments on the horror and futility of such actions, creating the impression not only of a frustrating, aimless, inconclusive war, even when our side was making slow, incremental, cumulative progress, but also of an unusually cruel and destructive war. Of course, the cruelty of the other side could not be shown because they did not allow American cameramen to film them. Hertz goes on to talk about the 1968 Tet Offensive. The offensive produced a terrible shock in the American people. On the night of January 30th, 19 VC sappers blew a hole in the wall around the American embassy in Saigon and assaulted the embassy itself. There were tremendous negative headlines in the U.S. This event, together with the VC and NVA attacks on virtually all the cities of South Vietnam, produced the impression that the enemy was everywhere, that his strength and determination must have been underestimated, that the communists could move wherever they liked in Vietnam despite our massive military presence, and that something was gravely wrong and that the war simply could not be won. The truth was, the 19 VC who had invaded the embassy's grounds never got into the building, and all were killed within hours. As far as the invasion of the city was concerned, the South Vietnamese troops fought surprisingly well, and together with American forces, inflicted terrible losses on the communists. All the while, the media focused on the event at the American embassy. It took a while before it was clear that the VC had failed and misinterpreted the widespread enemy attacks as evidence of communist strength, instead of understanding it for what it was, a desperate throw of the dice to impress American public opinion and thus influence American policy. Television newscasters termed the war lost because the rural areas through which the communist fighters had passed were now, quote, under communist control, unquote. Actually, it turned out the VC had to deplete their forces in the countryside in order to break into the cities. As a result of the Tet Offensive, the South Vietnamese government in the following year vastly extended its control in the countryside because big stretches of formerly insecure areas no longer had any VC or had VC who were so weak that they stopped fighting. This was a story that was not dramatic and thus not told. Hertz notes that during World War II there had been horrific photos and reports of the realities of war that the American people were prevented from seeing because the OWI held tight reins over what war correspondents and cameramen were allowed to report on. Only stories and images of the dastardly deeds of what the Germans and Japanese were doing to civilians and Allied soldiers were allowed to be shown or written about. During the Vietnam War, there was no OWI, and therefore the news media was allowed to print and broadcast whatever it wanted without any checks to even determine if it was accurate. Hertz says, so the Tet Offensive, while objectively clearly a defeat for the NVA and VC, was subjectively perceived in the United States as a defeat for the U.S. and its South Vietnamese ally, and this had very important consequences. Not only was our side, and not the side of our enemies, shown in the most distasteful light, but the pictures of death and destruction of refugees and civilian suffering, juxtaposed against the earlier optimistic claims that had been made about the progress of the war, created a war of revulsion and pessimism. As Hertz says, it did not matter that the enemy had lost huge numbers and that the civilian populace did not rise up to support their communist liberators. In the eyes of America, it was their own boys who were the bad guys, and the sooner we abandoned our South Vietnamese allies and left them to the unmerciful mercy of the communists, the better. In Hertz's view, the real crime was getting out when we were on the verge of victory. While the anti-war movement started small, it grew until it could no longer be ignored. Perception became reality. If Americans think we're losing, then we must be losing. Again, Vietnam was different from World War II, when famous movie stars and sports stars such as Clark Gable, Jimmy Stewart, and Joe DiMaggio signed up to do their patriotic duty. You younger people here today probably don't recognize those names. During Vietnam, many celebrities delighted in opposing the war, denigrating American patriotism and heroism, and giving aid and comfort to the enemy. The fifth main reason why we didn't win is probably the fact that we lacked a clear-cut strategy. Defeating or invading North Vietnam was never the end game, because we feared that Red China and the Soviet Union would enter the conflict, and then we'd have another world war on our hands, this time probably nuclear. So the goal was only to contain communism and prevent a takeover of South Vietnam. I liken this to a football coach telling his team before a big game, "Okay, men, let's go out there and play for a tie." The result was a national tragedy. The U.S. lost over 58,000 killed and over 150,000 wounded. The communists lost much more, upwards of 1 million. And yet they came out on top. So how did that happen? Well, they had greater motivation, greater will to win, no matter how heavy the sacrifice. And perhaps most importantly, they were fighting on and for their homeland. I think we can draw a parallel with our own Revolutionary War, in which we were fighting on and for our homeland against the greatest military fighting force in the world at that time. So I guess you could call Ho Chi Minh the George Washington of Vietnam. Since the war, dramatic changes have occurred. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam was renamed the Socialist Republic of Vietnam in April of '76. And in 1977, Vietnam became a member of the United Nations. In the intervening years, many Americans have gone back to Vietnam. This is my friend Ted Engelman, who will be talking about his journeys back to Vietnam next Saturday. And when they got there, they found a prosperous country. It says Saigon, but it was changed to Ho Chi Minh City, which I refuse to say. To find a prosperous country that, although communist, is now one of America's major trading parties, and people who warmly welcome their one-time enemy. Swords have truly been turned into plowshares. And I find it ironic that the war divided a united country, us, and united a divided one. So I want to thank you very much today for your attention. We do have a couple of minutes, so maybe I can entertain a question or a comment or two.
Excellent, Flint.
Thank you, Bear. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering about the policy of for the unfettered media. How did that come about with having the constraints during World War II and virtually no constraints during Vietnam? How did that happen? Was there an overt decision, or was it just?
That's a great question, and I don't know who made that decision or how it was made. I think there was a sense of we want to give the public uncensored news about what was going on there, and I think it backfired on us.
What was it like during Korea that was in between the two? Was
Yeah.
there an erosion of control at that point?
I think the news coming out of Korea was also controlled, but because we did not have a government agency like the OWI after World War II, there was not a, you might say, a well thought out plan on how to control information coming out of the war zone.
Some people think that McNamara was an adverse effect for the outcome of the war. What's your opinion on that?
McNamara had really great eyebrows and a great chin. And I'm not going to go any farther about that.
Oily hair.
I think he was kind of caught between two worlds. wanting to fight the war in a military manner and yet being constrained by political considerations that wouldn't allow him to do what he wanted to do. Because he wanted to take the war north into North Vietnam, but everybody in Washington was saying, no, no, we don't want to do that.
He was like the coach that said, tie your hands behind your back and move in for a tie.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. Yes, sir.
Why was there not better intelligence with the North moving through Cambodia for the incursion into South Vietnam?
Yeah, why wasn't there? I think there were people within the intelligence community who said something big is going to happen. We were seeing a lot of traffic on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We have no idea what's about to happen, and it was just kind of,
We had the
put on the back
intel,
show.
but it wasn't acted upon. It was
Yeah.
ignored.
We actually had acoustic sensors along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Those acoustic sensors were some of the missions that we flew with the A-6s, because we were, from the Confidant, we were controlled to where they heard the voices. That information that they heard over the acoustic sensors was taped and translated for intelligence purposes, obviously. But again, we did not do enough of the bombing and act on that intelligence.
Well, let's have one more question here, and then I'll have Mike say a few things.
So I was just gonna say, at the same time as they were getting ready for Tent, Quezon was going on. And Quezon absorbed a lot of attention by the media and the military and the logistics that went to Quezon. So Tet happened right after that. And it was,
And that could have been a diversionary
it was
thing that the North did to divert everybody's attention to what was happening there and not pay attention to what was happening elsewhere.
Grady was.
Don't forget to ask for artifacts.
Yes, I'm going to do that right now. Mike?
Well, a question for all of us. Why couldn't we have gotten an ending in Vietnam similar to what occurred in Korea?
We played
Why?
dumb.
Yeah, Don.
So this is only a question, but I've thought about it for a long time. One of the big strategic and
How about answer
cultural
my
debates
question?
in the United States was, one side said it was an invasion. Those who disagreed said it was a civil war. And I've asked myself this question more than once. What if that was, in part of a number of points you made, Flint, a false dichotomy?
Well, I don't have time to answer that question now.
You have an
But-
answer to your own question, Mike?
Well, I want to hear,
I think
What
part
you
of it
thought?
was the geography. A big part was geography, and the other part was just how the press handled it and what they told the United States
okay,
public.
that, obviously, the whole press in Westmoreland and all of that was significant. But ultimately, at least in my view, the difference was geography. In Korea, you had a peninsula. Once you controlled the border, which was essentially 150 mile, you controlled any sort of infiltration, anything else coming there. Look at the map of Vietnam. You had 1,200 miles of uncontrolled border, triple canopy. As long as that existed, you forever were going to be in a battle, and particularly on the other side, the Russians and the Chinese were just pushing, everything they could. So at least to me, you probably never had a chance to accomplish what would have been at least a peaceful and independent South Vietnam because of your geography. And look at us in Afghanistan. We didn't do any better with that.
It took 8 years before we had a President Nixon who authorized the mining of Haiphong Harbor. That was huge. And Nellie mined it.
Yeah, one of the things that happened after our squadron and our air wing from the carrier, the USS Coral Sea, in May of 1972, when they came back from that mission, the CO, the commander, Cag Sheets, who was a really great guy, said, You know what? The only thing I can say about this is, we're about 7 years too late on our time on target. And he was absolutely correct. So those 3 years from 68 to 71, we basically made North Vietnam a sanctuary, because we didn't bomb.
I'd like, just before I have to scoot, Grady, if you would come up here, I want you to see this gentleman here. This is Grady Birdsong, wonderful name, almost as good as Flint Whitlock. He's my Marine buddy. What we want to do when we get ready to put up our new exhibit on Vietnam, we want to have more artifacts than we presently have in storage here or on display in the Vietnam room. So any of you who are Vietnam graduates, if you have souvenirs that you brought home from the war and you think you'd like to show them off in our exhibit on a temporary loan, 3 or 4 months probably, please see Grady after today's session and give him your name and contact information and an idea of what kind of artifacts you have. And then we'll arrange for you to get them to our curator so they can be logged in properly. So this is the man to see. And again, I want to thank you all. I'm sorry I have to rush, but Mike, if you want to continue on any discussion here with our group.
We could, as long as people.
Yeah, so thank you again. Have a great weekend. Thank you. And go Colorado Academy.
Do any of you have any other observations you want to make concerning any aspects of Flint's talk? Yeah, Jim?
That little yellow book by Hertz
Yes.
is in our library.
Yeah, it's out of print, and we have one copy. But to me, it's the most excellent summary of both the history, what shaped the character of the Vietnamese, particularly the North and the South, and kind of got up into when things really started going bad. Fortunately, he's dead now. He was ambassador there. He was involved with much of the negotiations early on, between us and the North Vietnamese and stuff like that. But it's an excellent book. And you probably could, if you want to get a copy, you could probably get it through Amazon. That's kind of how I got my copy of the thing. But again, what Flint, was pointing out, the issues related to an open society, and particularly one where you're having elections every 2 years for the House and, 6 years for the Senate, and an open, society for the newspapers and, the media and everything is much more difficult to fight a war, a long, drawn-out engagement, than a society that's totally closed. And that was part of the challenge. And our country was going through all sorts of turmoil at the same time as well. With riots and stuff in the cities, you name it. So it's not surprising that very quickly the U.S. population, lost interest in this. And you see the same thing, going on now, I think, with respect to Ukraine. And we aren't doing anything in terms of putting any of our soldiers at risk.
Let me have something to add. I had no idea where in the hell I was at when I was over there. When I first got there, we were set up to Hue City for the Tet Offensive, and I said to myself, why the hell would somebody name a city W-A-Y? It's H-U-E. I got there as a new guy, and after the war, I wanted to know what had happened in the war. So I started reading. I read a lot of books. I've actually written a couple here and there. And in my research, I found that even though we had won most of the battles, especially the Hue City area, the Quezon, that The Vietnamese, they were done. And in the book, by Colonel Bui Tin, his book, he defected to the United States. He indicated in the book, or alluded to, that the cadre, the North Vietnamese, had thought that they had lost the war at the time. But with the news and the protests by all of the students in the United States going on, that, hey, wait a minute, if we go back to waging a counterinsurgency with the geographics that this lady mentioned earlier, the geography, we can do a limited war, and we can keep these Americans tied down. And with the negotiations in Paris at the peace talks, why, you can see how it evolved. So anyway, that's my perspective.
I think
Yes.
it's interesting to think how this all started, and that Ho Chi Minh actually wanted to go with the United States, but it didn't work that way for him, so then he turned exclusively to the communists.
Yeah, well, he was communist to start with.
I
You know,
understand
and
that,
stuff. His
but
interest was getting the French out of, because essentially what happened is when the Japanese, surrendered, the British, were the ones who initially moved in to take control of the Japanese, prisoners and control of all of this. And then, what the British did is then the French wanted to come back in. So they basically turned out all control over to the French. Now, part of the reason we wanted to support the French is Eisenhower and Kraut was more worried about Europe. The threats from the Russians, continuing across the border and all of that. And we were trying to woo the French into joining NATO. And so you didn't want to piss off the French. And so, one way of not pissing them off is don't kick them out of, trying to regain control of this. I mean, history's messy. And we're all looking back with perfect clarity, and the whole world, was just beginning to recover from World War II. If you think about turmoil and stuff going on, it was everywhere, and very much in Europe and Eastern Europe.
so when France lost Vietnam and they pulled out, or did we go in?
Well, okay, that was all part of the Geneva Accord, the
Ah,
1954 agreement, which was very similar to what was negotiated for Northern Korea. At the end of World War II, the Chinese, the Russians came in from the north to seize this. There was a bit of the South which we were supporting. And there was an agreement which said, we're gonna make a cut right here to separate North and South. After a year or so, we'll have a vote and kumbaya, and whatever everyone's decide, that'll be it. Well, of course it fell apart. As part of the consolidation of control here, they were very brutal, so you had a whole flood of people fleeing south. The same thing that occurred in the north. You had the French there for 100 years. Well, a significant part of the upper population, the higher ups, were Catholic, So what's gonna happen? They all fled south. Being the upper echelon, they became the upper echelon, within the South. It was just very, very kind of messy, and we were so concerned, again, what Flint brought up. The domino theory was very much very much concern. If, South Vietnam fell, well, Cambodia's gonna go, Thailand's gonna go. Laos already, for practical purposes, is gone. And this area also was viewed as having a lot of resources. The reason the Japanese wanted this area during the war is rubber and oil, for down through here. So, Don.
I don't know how many people have read The War of the Running Dogs, which was a successful counter-Chinese communist effort to take over Malaysia. I think it's a useful study because it at least challenges some of our assumptions on both sides.
Yeah, but the British were able to stop that.
Well, why were they? It's interesting to read the
Well,
book.
part of it, you're an isolated, you know, it wasn't exactly like this.
Yes, but there was
You could.
also the issue that the British colonial government was actually reasonably effective. They actually taught people how to be self-governing. And that led to a lot of support, including the fact that they were very anti-Chinese, which makes them like the Indo-Chinese who fought China for 1,000 years and had another battle with them and beat them. But if you have no tradition of representative government, you make the assumption that if you support a despotic, formerly despotic colonial rule, I think you're always going to be in trouble.
Well, I mean, even looking at South Korea, you know, they went through a whole, you know, decades of turmoil to including despotic,
This
you know,
Japanese rule, we had no idea.
well, true, I'm talking post-war.
It
You
took
know,
how many years before?
you know, organizing a new country,
Bingo.
you know, is kind of complicated,
Miss,
and messy, the thing, yeah.
The map of French Indochina shows that it actually included Laos and Cambodia as part of the Vietnam.
Yes.
Was that all separated out in the 54 Accord?
That I don't know. Yeah, this whole area was, you know, Indochina, and it could have been part of that. But even then, within Vietnam, there was what Cochin China, which was kind of, there was a southern part, which is, I think they called Cochin China. North was another name, and then there was a middle section. And historically, they all were kind of different, and they all were fighting each other. And even was kind of brought out when the North Vietnamese came down and started fighting down here. They forever were complaining about their South Vietnamese compatriots here, because they said, rather than spending your time studying all this stuff, the South Vietnamese fighters there were off having a good time, you know, kind of partying and just totally different. And you even today see it, you know. I think America's kind of nice. What country beats up on everybody for 10, 15 years, and then you're invited back, you know, to not only invest, but come tour, you know. My division was based in Cu Chi, which was just kind of up in this area. Well, Cu Chi is now a big tourist attraction. And why? The North Vietnamese had an extensive tunnel complex right underneath our division base.
All the way up into Cambodia.
What more could you want? I mean, the safest place you could be, you know, is right underneath your enemy. And we never knew it. But nowadays, you take a tour back to Vietnam, you come into Saigon, they'll take you up there and gladly show you. Yes.
So different perspectives were going on earlier before the war really took off, but in 1964, the author David Halberstam, who was a young journalist, went over and spent a year. And he didn't know much, he didn't know anything about Vietnam, but he decided to go out into the villages. He spent almost the entire time in the villages. And he learned very quickly that in the daytime, South Vietnamese soldiers or assistants would come through, but the night always belonged to the Viet Cong, or the early Viet Minh. And he was there for a year, and he saw this, and he's, at the end of this year, he wrote a book, and he said, if we do not, or South Vietnam does not control the villages, the war will never be won. And then he went back a couple of years to read back, and he said nothing had changed. So he basically said, because the villages do not belong to South Vietnam.
Yeah. And that's what, you know, Mao Zedong kind of said is part of his, you know, whatever, a philosophy approach to, you know, guerrilla warfare. Control the countryside, and then you will control ultimately the cities. And we saw that even in our experience in Afghanistan. Once we withdrew our advisors and stuff from the field, from you know, out in the countryside in the city. We, you know, what are the, the young, militia guys gonna do out there? You lose that, and then you withdraw into the cities, and then the collapse is inevitable. That's what kind of happened. So,
The British were successful in Burma, and what is now Malaysia, because they were much better at counterinsurgency warfare. And we had a cadre of believers in what the British had done. Books had been written. We were trying to teach it and institute a similar kind of counter-guerrilla, counterinsurgency warfare in Vietnam. But at the elite leadership level, the level of people like Westmoreland, they still were seeing the war in terms of large conventional forces, armor, air power, and the Marine Corps up in I Corps, northern part of South Vietnam, that they were responsible for. They did have counterinsurgency where they went out and lived in the villages. It was called a pacification program, and it was relatively
Combined action
successful.
group,
Combined action.
very successful,
well, the other
but it
thing-
wasn't bought in by Westmoreland. He didn't like it.
He was in the body count.
Yeah.
Well, but that was because of McNamara. We
Yeah.
needed some way of being able to explain how
Quantify.
progress was being made. And so you had to quantify number of munitions, number of bodies.
I also found in my
Control.
research that the CIA had better numbers than MACV did, Military Assistance Command Vietnam. If you took the order of battle from the MACV people and multiplied it by 2 or 3 times, you'd have the exact number of order of battle, NVA, BC, main force, so on and so forth.
Yeah, Don?
I'd like to support what the Marines are saying, because it's not a position that's heard often enough. The War of the Running Dogs in Malaysia, it was Chinese who were not Malaysian, they were from outside. They were, knew the British as a reasonably positive colonial force, not as the enemy. When you look at how we were perceived, I read an interesting book, autobiography, an American Chinese doctor who flew the hump to take care of American soldiers and Chinese. He got diverted because the Japanese took over Hong Kong before he could get through to see his old father and tell him he was gonna make his father proud. So he ends up in Hanoi in about 1938 or 39. And he has one sentence in there about how intensely the French were hated. And we looked a lot like the French.
Well, you also had the Dutch experience, in Indonesia, where they were absolutely brutal against the independence kind of movements there. So that whole thing, I think, clouded everybody and certainly swept us under the same mantle. The one other thing that just dawned on me too is we're gonna be commenting that in 1964, 1965 was the big change. That was when we first started inserting US ground forces in any sort of strength. And what you do see, what's occurring at that same time, all the support we're giving the South Vietnamese now went to the US forces. All the way up to probably close to 1970, our forces were getting the M16, M60. We were getting everything, the first priority for any sort of airstrikes, everything went mainly to the US forces. We kind of pushed the South Vietnamese forces off to the side. And, kind of take care of this little thing. And when you start doing that, one, you weaken them, two, you start losing confidence in yourself. And again, we were looking for the same type of pitch battles that the French thought they could do. And, we fought, one of our guys, Bill Bates, and there was another, Jim Wasson, I think, helicopter pilot for the Battle of Hamburger Hill. We fought for a long time to take that hill, lost all sorts of guys, helicopters and everything, and then what? We withdrew. I lost 8 classmates in a 90-day period fighting over a hill up, in the 101st area. And then the problem was, once you kind of had this hill, which we kind of, did control, once the weather turned bad, you couldn't resupport it. You couldn't resupply it. So lo and behold, you withdraw. And that time and again seemed to be, the approach we seem to be taking. But again, at least in my mind, if this this had been the geography, I'm quite convinced you would have had a result like that. But instead, you had a geography where you could never control that border, where they had a sanctuary just, 5 miles away, which we couldn't go after. And then you also had the Russians who had a first, row seat of seeing how their anti-aircraft missiles could work, as we sent our bombers time and again, against Haiphong and Hanoi. And I never realized, we lost lots of B-52 bombers, which I never realized, wasn't talked about. But, you
During
blow up
linebacker
something.
too,
Linebacker.
December of '72.
My
Yeah.
cousin was in charge of that.
Yeah, and the thing that I love, say we should support Ukraine to the hill, is, boy, you get a chance to check out, every new advanced weapon system you got and see how it actually works against something. And that's what the Russians did. They supplied every NVA, Vietcong with AK-47s. Our South Vietnamese forces were still using the carbine, up until probably 70 and stuff. It's a sad experience. I'm not certain we learned the right lessons. But again, saying on the positive side, not many countries are more than welcome to have us come back, and visit with them and do whatever. So.
Yeah, just on Ukraine, we had a young woman here probably about a year ago, and she had come over from Ukraine, and she was talking about how great it was to have the Americans sending over all this defense equipment and ammo and stuff. But nobody was showing them how to build a government to sustain a country. I'm wondering if that...
Well, that'll come later. It's kind of hard to say you're gonna have an open election and all that stuff in the middle of a major war where you're not certain you're gonna survive. But they wanna look west for economics, for everything. And obviously the Russians don't want that.
A positive thing the U.S. did in the Balkans was we said in exchange for our aircraft and our intelligence, you Europeans have to agree, after we prevail, to send in European-style bureaucrats that know how to run local governments, provincial governments, and national governments in a representative way. I don't think they've taken those countries and turned them into perfect democracies, but they actually gave them the tools of representative government, and it seems to have helped a number of them be self-governing. And that was the deal. We'll give you our technology. We're not sending any American troops in. You guys have to take care of that, and you are responsible for the aftermath.
Yeah, and that's a very viable offer for that. So I think just kind of in closing, for those of you, if you can join us for the symposium, you'll hear the stories of a bunch of us here. And I think the key is we all had a different experience. And if you ask any of us what was going on in Vietnam or the bigger picture at the time, none of us knew. I commanded a combat engineer company in infantry division. All I knew at all, I could say, was in an immediate sector around where we were needing to operate and what was the latest. You had no idea what was going on beyond and stuff. Yeah, Ed?
I'm wondering, stepping back a little bit, is the whole issue of different races, totally different cultures, totally different ways of doing business. And I don't think we really understood that. And a lot of people have taught. And this is not to justify Ho Chi Minh,
but he was first and foremost a Vietnamese.
Right.
And, forget the word, you know where I'm probably going. And I think we don't address that particular issue, and we lose out. Whereas, and I'm not sure we've learned enough to recognize these are countries we can help. We do not have to project an American view on the world.
Yeah, and that's what we were trying to do.
Exactly.
And stuff. So, you know, anyway, Flint gave a great talk, lots of info and how we kind of got there. We still haven't sorted out, I'd say, the role of media and the political and all that stuff, but we're an open society, at least for now. I'm kind of getting worried and stuff. But you didn't have that ever on, authoritarian side and stuff. And in fact, the thing which I found interesting, if you ever have watched, who's the guy who does these marvelous history things, did the Civil War? Ken Burns. He did one on the Vietnam War.
Yep.
And the thing which struck me so much is when they talked to North Vietnamese families and stuff, the sadness they felt, of what occurred, and the fact that their young sons, daughters, the government could just grab them up, send them off south. They never heard anything of what happened to them, and there was great sadness both in the north and obviously the south. And sadly, it's the population, who always get caught in the middle. And you saw this at our last speaker, Stuart Goldstein, who was a young medic, Navy, served in the South Vietnamese hospital up toward First I Corps, and they often the times had to repair the damage caused by our own, bombing and things to local civilians, and what the North Vietnamese people. So anyway, well, thank you very much for joining us. I think the discussion was great, and Flint's talks are always excellent. So anyway, hopefully we'll see you Saturday, next week. He should Flint needs to make more of this. Well,